Okay, so we're going to give it just a little time to make sure. There we go. Okay. All right, so I am Terry Camerzell here with Creation Fellowship Santee. We're a group of friends bound by our common agreement that the creation account as told in Genesis is a true depiction of how God created life and everything in just 6 days a few thousand years ago. We've been meeting here on the Zoom platform since June of 2020, and we've been blessed by a variety of speakers who have presented on topics that are creation science, other theology, and even current events. You can find links to most of our past presentations by typing in tinyurl.com/CF Santee. That's C like creation, F like fellowship, and Santee is spelled Santee. You can also email us at creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com so that you get on our mailing list. We don't spam, and that way you'll get emails to all of our upcoming Thursday night speakers. Tonight, we're blessed to have back our friend Frank Sherwin. Frank works with ICR, that's Institute for Creation Research. In fact, ICR is the founder of the museum where we used to meet in person down in Santee, California. And so we're blessed by the legacy that they've left, that we've been able to enjoy learning more about creation because of that. So tonight, Frank, sorry, I'm a little distracted, but Frank Sherwin received his bachelor's degree in biology from Western State College in Colorado, and he attended graduate school at the University of Northern Colorado, where he studied under the late Gerald D. Schmidt, one of the foremost parasitologists in America. In 1985, Dr. Sherwin obtained his master's degree in zoology. He published his research in the peer-reviewed Journal of Parasitology. And in 2021, he received an honorary doctorate of science from Pensacola Christian College. So you can find more of his work by visiting the ICR website. That's icr.org. And with that, we're happy to have him talk to us tonight about his book, Guide to God's Animals. Go ahead, Frank.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Terry and Robin, for giving me a hand and helping me out and getting through all of this, and that's much appreciated. And I am a zoologist, specifically what we call an invertebrate zoologist. I study parasites. That's what my master's degree was in. And I've learned very quickly that you don't have to go to France to study parasites. And so I started doing that. And I have two very special people that are watching here this evening. Thank you, Terry. And one of those is David McQueen, Professor David McQueen, a flood geologist that I've known since the early 80s, when David and I and 18 other people went to Grand Canyon and studied Grand Canyon from a flood geology perspective. And then also I have my Maliki Devushka, well, really, I call her Kuritsa, Maria, and Maliki Kuritsa is little chicken in Russian, and so Maria is joining us as well, and that's wonderful. Maria was born in Pensacola, and so let's go ahead and look at God's animals, in the portions of which are taken from my book, God's Guide to the Animals, and let's see now. It is not forwarding like I hope it would do. There we go. Good. All right. And what we find is, when it comes to the origin of animals, and if I could just kind of go off to the side a little bit and mention that the infamous book that Charles Darwin used to turn the Western world upside down was, of course, The Origin of Species. And it was published in 1859. And it was simply that. It turned the Western world upside down, even though Darwin never mentioned in his book the origin of the species. He talked a lot about minor variation, for example, of wild rock pigeons and things such as that. But he never got around to addressing the origin of the species. And that is a problem that has continued on into the year 2023. And an individual by the name of Cook at the University of Leeds just 1 year ago said, it's not precisely known when animals emerged or what conditions they encountered in the oceans or on land. And that really is almost the whole ball of wax, isn't it? I mean, we want to know about the origin of animals before we start talking about animals. And right out of the gate, right at square one, the evolutionists, and I'm not criticizing them, but they simply don't know where animals came from. One publication talked about the muddy origins of animal evolution, muddy as in unclear. And this was said just 2 short years ago. They still don't know where animals came from. What was their origin? Keeping in mind that Darwin never talked about the origin of species in his infamous book, he talked a lot about minor variation, which creationists don't have any problems with. Well, understanding how and when animals evolved has proved very difficult for those who study fossils. Now, this individual is from that little Bible college back east called Yale University. And this individual is intellectually honest enough to admit they don't know how or when animals evolved. And so once again, I'm setting the stage for this whole issue of the origin of animals before we get into talking about the specific kinds of animals that we see in the world around us. An individual by the name of Smith said in 2015, writing in The Great Transformations in Vertebrate Evolution by Ken Dial, she said, quote, while and there's that word again, origin of mammals has proved one set of puzzles, the diversification of mammals is also ripe with questions. And the mammalia, the mammals, is a very large group of animals. And to state that they simply talk about the origin of mammals is a puzzle, I think is a breath of fresh air. I'm glad that they said that, because the alternative to evolution is creation, and we have an answer as to the origin of the animals. And here's a cover of this book, Great Transformations in Vertebrate Evolution. If you have some extra money, I would suggest that you go on Amazon.com and get this book, because of what it admits and what it doesn't tell you about great transformations in vertebrate evolution. For example, in this book that I've read this book now, and they never mention, Ken Dial and his co-editors never mention, for example, one group of mammals called the bats. And if there isn't a greater transformation of a rodent into a bat, then I don't know what it would be. But a rodent's front legs turning into the wings of a bat is certainly a great transformation, which, as I say, is not addressed in this 2015 book. That's kind of strange. This is a very religious statement. I could never say this without kind of chuckling, and I don't mean disrespectful or anything with the evolutionist, but the individual who said this is a guy by the name of Musser. And when it says et al. After his name, that means 12 other evolutionists. So 13 evolutionists said 2 years ago in one of the most prestigious science publications in the world today, and that would be Science Magazine, they admitted to well, they didn't admit, they simply gave I think, a very religious statement, which is void of any kind of empirical evidence. And that is, they said that sponges represent our distant animal relatives. Well, folks, that's quite a statement to make, and one should be ready to back that up with some good empirical research to validate such I'm calling it a very religious statement. And sponges are a unique group of animals, and I liked, as an invertebrate zoologist, to study sponges. Here, for example, is a picture of a sponge. It almost looks animated, but these are simply what we call in zoology the incurrent and excurrent canals of the sponge there going into the cavity. But when you look at this picture of a typical sponge, it might remind you of, well, it might remind you of something like, I'm not sure, but anyway, again, sponges represent our distant animal relatives. That was said by no less than, as I've mentioned, 13 scientists who believe that we have a genetic connection to sponges, and I can assure you that is simply not true. Well, this is a book by Homer Smith, and it was published, as you can see there, 1953. And I use this as an example of gradualism because Homer Smith was a gradualist. He was an atheist. And the title of the book kind of catches you, From Fish to Philosopher. And you could also say particles to people or molecules to man. But this whole idea of phyletic gradualism or gradualism has been around ever since Darwin. Phyletic gradualism states that macroevolution, that is the really big change, the fish to philosopher type change, is merely the operation of small change or microevolution, which operates gradually and more or less continuously over relatively long periods of time. Well, that's what phyletic gradualism is all about. Back in 1953, when Homer Smith was talking about it, let's go ahead and look at, maybe the year 2020 and see that according to Hickman and four other evolutionists writing in their Integrated Principles of Zoology text, the 18th edition, just 3 years ago, they said that gradualism is still controversial. So this whole issue of slow and gradual change over the alleged millions and millions of years of time is not set in stone, no pun intended. It is still controversial. There are still a host of unanswered questions regarding gradualism, the slow and gradual change as you see in the illustration in the slide there. It's still controversial. What we don't see is one kind of animal turning into, or if you will, evolving into another kind of animal. We don't see hybrids like this. Well, I did see, well, never mind, I won't get into that. So we have these very unique animals here that we can see with Photoshop, but such animals, of course, do not exist. What we believe, of course, is six literal 24-hour creation, and that God, in the beginning, God created one of the most, if I could say this, one of the most scientific statements that have ever been said. And so we would go back to the beginning, thousands of years ago, to the book of Genesis, edited by Moses, the 50 chapters of Genesis that describes origins. And God was there in the beginning. He told us what he did. Genesis chapter 1 tells us about the creation of living creatures. And God makes it very, very clear in Genesis chapter 1 that he did not use evolution. Let me repeat that. God makes it very, very clear in Genesis chapter 1 that he did not use evolution. Well, Frank, how can you say such a thing? Because as we read in Genesis chapter 1, do you remember what it says? It says that God created after their kind. And God not only says that once, he says it 10 times. So 10 times God tells us in Genesis chapter 1 that he created after their kind. And if that's true, and it is certainly true, God said it there in the first chapter of Genesis, if he created after their kind, then evolution is a no-show. Evolution simply did not happen because God created each after their kind, and that's what we see today. No surprise there, of course. So we believe six literal 24-hour days of creation just thousands of years ago. And so we look at, for example, camels. I like to begin with camels, and you'll find them in the Holy Land. They are prized in desert countries because they are so well designed for such conditions, from the bushy eyebrows, unique nostrils, three-chambered stomach, and tough split feet. This ship of the desert, as they call it, shouts design. Camels are absolutely incredible in their design, and without a surprise, we know that camels have always been camels. They did not evolve from some non-camel ancestor. And I like what the Lord Jesus says in Matthew 23, you blind guides which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. And in those days where Lord Jesus was teaching and preaching, a gnat was the world's smallest animal, according to people that were there. They didn't know any smaller animals than a gnat. And the largest animal they ever knew about was the camel. So the Lord Jesus is using two teaching aids that people could relate to. Well, Camels are able to withstand changes in body temperature and water consumption that would kill most other mammals. That's because the Lord has designed them to be ships of the desert. When the camel exhales, and this is fascinating, water vapor becomes trapped in their nostrils in a group of baffles in the nose called turbinates. And the water vapor becomes trapped in their nostrils, specifically the turbinates, and is reabsorbed into the body as a means to conserve water. Just absolutely fascinating. The nostrils can close to protect nasal passages from blowing sand. So everything you see about a camel is so exquisitely designed to withstand the rigors of the desert. And so we can see, for example, human and camel red blood cells are quite different, even though people and camels are both classified as mammals. Unlike other mammals, camels' red blood cells are oval shaped rather than circular in shape that we see with human red blood cells or erythrocytes. This helps with the flow of the red blood cells during dehydration, which camels can experience now and again in the desert. And right at the cellular level, we see the camels are exquisitely designed to withstand desert conditions. And so we find that camels have always been camels, as I mentioned just a minute ago. The fossil record shows no gradual evolutionary progression from non-camels to camels. The oldest fossil camel on record clocked in at about 1 million years, according to some research that was published, or at least described at Fox News in 2008. A year earlier, a giant camel fossil was found that would have stood about 12 foot tall, but was only, according to evolutionists, 100,000 years old. But the take-home point, at least when it comes to camels, is that they have always been camels. They didn't come from any other animal. God created camels as camels on day 6. Well, I love the ocean, and I wrote a book on the oceans. And the largest mammal, the largest animal in the world, of course, is the blue whale. And the blue whale, and I'm sorry because I do have some things on my screen here that is covering up things that I want to say, but we find that the heart is very, very large. I think it was about a half-ton heart. We find that the tongue weighs 2 tons, a 2-ton tongue. Try and say that very, very fast. We find that the calves, the baby whales or calves, can gain 50 pounds a day. That's in a day, so that's pretty amazing. And the calves nurse for 7 to 8 months, drinking 100 gallons of milk daily. Now, as a zoologist, I'm fascinated by how these calves can nurse from their mama underwater. And the Lord Jesus has designed what is called abdominal mammary slits. And so what we find is after the baby calf is born from the mama, it goes down by instinct to find these abdominal mammary slits after it takes a breath of air, and it is able to affix between the mammary slits its mouth over the nipple of the mom, and the mom can actually contract some very special muscles that will squirt those 100 gallons of milk daily into the calf. But what's amazing, and I like to emphasize, is that zoologists still are not sure as to the construction or as to how this exactly happens. They simply don't know the finer details of this. And we've had whales to study for well over a century, but they're still no closer to understanding the finer points or the details as to how this happens. Well, Frank, what do you mean? What I mean is simply this. How is it that when the calf gets that milk, it doesn't get a mouthful of seawater as well? Now, we know that seawater is full of sodium, full of potassium, full of other minerals and all that that can cause what we call an imbalance of the electrolyte level of the developing calf. That's why people who are shipwrecked or people who are out in the ocean and on a raft You don't want to drink the seawater because the seawater has such a high concentration of sodium and potassium, and it puts a strain on the kidneys, and the individual dies literally of dehydration surrounded by water. How is it that the calf is able to get pure mama's milk and never take in large volumes, or any volume for that matter, of seawater? That's a big mystery. Research needs to be done. But speaking of mammary glands from these abdominal mammary slits, you can see here on the screen that Hickman and four other authors, so 5 evolutionists said, and I quote, the fossil record is silent on the appearance of mammary glands. In other words, mammary glands not only of whales, but all the mammals, your dog, cat, people. The fossil record is silent on the appearance of mammary glands. And this is what 5 evolutionists said just a few years ago. The origin of lactation, milk production in mammals, remains a complex issue, according to Ken Cardong, who is a zoologist and an evolutionist, writing in his textbook in 2012, not too awfully long ago. And so when you put it all together, they don't know the origin of mammary glands or the lactation of those mammary glands. It is exquisitely complex and sophisticated. It's not easy at all. I've had several classes in histology, which is a study of tissues, and we would go into detail investigating it, but it is a very, very complex process. This is one of my favorite quotes when it comes to the supposed origin of the cetacea, which are the whales. And this is from the American Museum of Natural History, New York. Certainly not the friend of the creationists by any stretch. And look when it was said. It was said just 2 years ago in 2021. But how and when cetacean, that is whale ancestors, became fully aquatic remains a subject of, look at this, intense debate. Not just discussion, but intense debate. We are being told over and over again that whales evolved from some terrestrial animal, 7, 8 million plus years ago. But this is intensely debated, and I'm only too happy to share that with God's people. Now, why did I show the rainbow trout there? Because the rainbow trout can easily swim in the major blood vessels of the blue whale above. And so that gives you an appreciation for how big these blood vessels are in the blue whale that you can have. Don't try this at home, but a rainbow trout can easily swim in the major blood vessels of blue whale. And speaking of blood vessels, that means that the heart, you see the quote about how big the heart is there at the top of the screen. The heart is very, very huge. And a man got lost inside of a whale heart, and this shows him coming out after being lost for 2.5 days inside the whale heart. He finally made his way out. It's that big. Okay, I'm joking a little bit. We can have a little bit of levity, can't we, Terry? All right, good. And so this gives you an appreciation for just how big this whale heart is, as around 1/2 ton. Well, the origin of dinosaurs or dragons, and we at ICR believe that dragons and dinosaurs were synonymous, that in medieval times, when we read about the dragons, guess what? If the earth is as young as creationists maintain, then these dragons were really just dinosaurs that resulted from coming off of the ark and migrating throughout Europe approximately 4,500 years ago. But the point is, remember, Darwin's infamous book was called The Origin of Species. He never talked about the origin of species. This individual, Bernardi, and his fellow authors said in 2018, fairly recently, the mode and timing of the origin and diversification of the dinosaurs have so far been unresolved. So far as of 2018, here we are in 2023, I can assure you they still don't know the origin and diversification of the dinosaurs. This is something I didn't know even through my undergraduate time in college, but it's the best kept secret that evolutionists certainly don't know. When you dig down in the fossil record, the sedimentary rocks, looking for dinosaurs, the first thing you find as you're looking for them are 100% dinosaurs. You don't find their evolutionary ancestors. You just find dinosaurs. And according to 5 evolutionists, how the various dinosaur groups arose is a puzzle, what they said in 2020. So again, very, very recently, what can we say this evening? Dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs. And here we have a reference to some of these dinosaurs, such as what was discovered in Alberta, Canada, March of 2011. And this is a fully mummified dinosaur. Mummification, you can't have mummification lasting 66 million years or 100 million years. But this is what was found here, a mummified dinosaur. That's as good as, I would say, is almost as good as finding soft dinosaur tissue. And Psalm 91 talks about, thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shall thou trample under feet. And so this is further evidence that dragons were animals as real as adders and lions, that is, dinosaurs. And so scripture, I think, is very, very clear about that. And this gets to be exciting when you study origins, creation, and evolution, and what the Bible has to say. Like Baryonyx, the Dracorex Pachycephalosaurus fossil is strong evidence that dragons were real and that the biblical record of dinosaurs and humans living together is true. We don't find them buried together because they didn't live together. They were separated ecologically, even though they were both created, dinosaurs and people, on day 6. They lived in different ecological zones, and so we wouldn't expect them to be buried together in the sedimentary rock units. Dracorex may represent a juvenile of Pachycephalosaurus. And so we see these kinds of fossils here, and we are amazed at how well preserved the fossils are, that they weren't slowly and buried by sediment accumulation spanning years or many years of time. They're just lying in a pristine condition at the bottom of a lake or a stream or something like that. No, what we like to say at ICR is that floods form fossils fast. Floods form fossils fast. And the reason why, as you look at this fossil right here, a Pachycephalosaurus, is that it was suddenly and catastrophically buried, like you would get with a with a flood. A flood could do something like that. A really catastrophic flood, maybe a flood that was regional or continental, maybe a real big flood that perhaps even covered the entire planet. And so these are some of the Pachycephalosaurus fossils. Just fascinating. You can spend a lifetime just studying these fossils. The great sea dragon may have been an explosion-producing mechanism to enable it to be a real fire-breathing dragon. And this is what it says in Job chapter 41. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook? His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. Now, folks, right here, the evolutionists like to just laugh us to scorn by maintaining that such a thing is impossible. And how in the world can you have an animal that would produce fire and flames and smoke and all of that? And just shows how juvenile the Bible is when it addresses issues like this, until some more research is being done. And I had a friend of mine who was teaching in a Christian college 20 plus years ago in Southern California. And I went into his lab one evening, and he was cleaning up. He had just had a lab session, and he told me to reach inside a heavy glass container. And I did so, and I found what I was looking for, and I picked it up betwixt my fingers. In Texas, we call these fangers, F-A-N-G-E-R-Z, fangers. And I held this beetle in my fingers, and I got it mad. I got it angry, and boom, an explosion. 212 degrees Fahrenheit went off from the rear end of that beetle against the pad of my finger, and it felt hot. I mean, it was really hot, and it was what we call a bombardier beetle. Bombardier beetles are a fact of life. Bombardier beetles are ubiquitous here in the United States, if you know where to look. And they are just a little beetle, but they are packed with a very sophisticated biochemical machinery. where it takes two compounds, one called hydroquinone. It's an organic compound. It's very toxic. And then hydroquinone was used back in the ancient days for developing something called film from a camera. Most of us probably never heard of film that went into a camera, but in those ancient days, that hydroquinone was used to develop that film and give you pictures. And then also the second compound, which is an inorganic compound, it's not carbon-based, is called hydrogen peroxide. Well, we've all heard of hydrogen peroxide, but the hydrogen peroxide you have in this little beetle is 3 to 5 times more concentrated than the 3% hydrogen peroxide you get at Walgreens. And so when you pour Walgreens hydrogen peroxide into a cut or a blemish, it stings. And it produces what, class? That's right, bubbles. What are those bubbles? Dave McQueen, you know what those bubbles are? Those are 100% oxygen. And so oxygen is being liberated because hydrogen peroxide has the formula H2O2. It has an extra oxygen atom. So when you see that bubbling there, those are the extra oxygen atoms being released in a very vigorous oxidation reaction. And so, but the hydrogen peroxide that is produced in these beetles is very concentrated. It's very toxic. And if you were to spill that on your skin, it would bubble and fizz your skin and and your muscle away, and you'd have nice white shiny bone. And so please don't try that at home. And so when you mix these two compounds together, nothing happens because you need special organic catalysts or biological catalysts called enzymes. Well, we've all heard of enzymes, but these enzymes work at a lower body temperature, and they work very, very specifically on a substrate, such as, for example, hydrogen peroxide. Gets into a lot of biochemistry, but nothing is left to chance. And so we find extreme biological engineering within this tiny beetle here, this bombardier beetle. What's my point? My point is, scripture here is talking in Job chapter 41 about his breath kindleth coals and a flame goes out of his mouth. Well, look what God has done with a little invertebrate, an insect that can produce an explosion at the boiling point of water very, very rapidly. And if God can put all of that biochemical machinery inside of a little beetle, I don't think it'd be any problem for him to do that with the kinds of creatures that we read about in the book of Job. Well, we also have, for example, and I like birds. I did my master's research on birds, and we have and I can't see it because I have a whole section here on my screen that's blocking out the titles. But it includes magpies and crows and jays, and perhaps Noah sent a raven from the ark due to its strong wings, about a 3-foot wingspan, and strong vision. And it says in Genesis chapter 8, and I just gave a presentation last night, Wednesday night, on Genesis chapter 7 and chapter 8. So here I am talking a different group, and again, mentioning Genesis chapter 8. It's kind of fun. And he sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried off of the earth. So this is very, very interesting, seeing what Mr. Noah did 4,500 years ago, looking for dry land after the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. Look what it says in Luke chapter 12. The Lord Jesus said, "Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which neither have storehouse nor barn, and God feedeth them." Look what it says in the 10 letters here, class. "How much more are you better than the fowls?" Well, that puts me on shouting ground. This is written for us. How much more are you better than the fowls? I just love that verse. We also find, for example, and I have no idea what the title at the top of the screen says, but this has to do with the hawk. And in Proverbs, I believe that's chapter 1 there, again, it's being blocked off. "Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird." And bird vision is enormously complex and very, very detailed. It's incredible what birds, specifically the raptors, can see at great distances. And it's all due to a structure you see there on the screen called the fovea. The fovea of the retina, the fovea is a portion of the retina, which is that portion of the back of the eyeball that has the rods and cones that you learned about in high school biology so long ago. Remember the rods and the cones and the retina? That the retina the fovea of the retina is responsible for sharp central vision. Hawks have been created with two fovea, the central pits with closely packed cones. That's what the fovea is. No rods, just cones. The central and peripheral. Humans have only a central one, but God created these particular birds to have two because they're raptors and they have to hunt and they have to see exquisitely what they're hunting from great distances. And so this is what uh, um, the cone looks like here. This green object is a diagrammatic cone, seeing that it is very exquisitely designed by the creator to do what it does, and that is help with the vision of these particular carnivorous birds. And so here we have, again, the cross section of the eye of a hawk. And we can see the retina there in the back of the eyeball, and we can see the shallow and the deep fovea that are pointed out there, showing that Jesus created this bird eye with not one but two. We have one; they have two of the fovea there, and it has 1.5 million fovea for the hawk, whereas we just have a paltry zero point 0.2 million for us. And that fovea with the particular structures there helps the bird to see very, very well. Well, but these are which ye shall not eat: the eagle and the osprey, which is the bearded vulture, and the osprey, talking about in Deuteronomy chapter 14 and Leviticus chapter 11. Now, these particular birds can ride thermals up to 13,000 feet and are able to spot dying or dead animals from that height. That's really high up there, but because the Lord Jesus has designed their eyes to see the way they do, they can see from that height. It's the only known bird to eat bone marrow, and it will drop bones from high altitude to crack the bone so they can eat the marrow. So the Lord Jesus has designed this bird to be kind of just a kind of a cleanup. It's like the shark. The shark can eat virtually anything to kind of help with the cleanup. That's why it's important to have sharks and not kill them, so they can be productive parts of the ecosystem of the ocean. And the same also goes to this particular bird too. They have been designed to be a cleanup crew to keep the environment cleaned up from these other animals. And the pelican, well, look at that. If you look closely at that picture, you can see a big fish in the bill of that pelican. We're all familiar with the long bill of the pelican, the lower half having an elastic pouch. And when with it, this bird can scoop up several quarts of water along with her prey. And so we are not surprised to find that, for example, pelicans have always been pelicans. David said, I am like a pelican of the wilderness. I'm like an owl of the desert, he said in Psalm 102. He is afflicted, comparing his situation to that of three birds that inhabited the wilderness where he lived and were considered of little worth in ancient Israel. And so what surprised them most about the ancient pelican as they were looking at, for example, a fossil, is that it's almost identical to modern species. Well, who's not surprised? That's right, the creationists, because we understand that in the beginning, God created, Genesis chapter 1, after their kind. And so we would find that pelicans have been created as pelicans. That means that pelicans and their huge beaks have survived unchanged. Remember what the definition of evolution is? Change. When you look at the pelican or the dinosaur or anything in between, they are unchanged. Since the Oligocene epoch, that said some scientists in the Journal of Ornithology, they're not creationists. They're being intellectually honest and saying, look, all we're finding is 100% pelicans. And this one individual, Dr. Louchart of the University of Lyon in France, said, it is so similar to modern pelicans despite its 30 million years in an interview of the prestigious BBC. And this is the fossil he was talking about. No evidence of any kind of real vertical evolution going on with these particular birds, or any birds for that matter. Pelicans in this example have always been pelicans. And I like the swallows here. These are amazing, beautiful birds, very hard to shoot, I have to say. I shot 35 of them back in the mid 1980s. It says in Jeremiah chapter 8, yea, the stork in the heaven knoweth her appointed times, and the turtle and the crane and the swallow observe the time of their coming, but my people know not the judgment of the Lord. And so I really do love the swallows. Like a crane or a swallow, so did chatter. I did mourn as a dove. My eyes fail when I look upward, O Lord. Lord, I am oppressed. Undertake for me, as Isaiah said in chapter 38. And so this is a research that got published. I only say this because evolutionists like to say that creationists, number one, they don't do any original research. That's wrong. And number two is they don't make any original discoveries. That's wrong. I discovered a new species of parasites called them nematode, and I named it Acuaria coloradensis because I found it in the state of Colorado. And number three, they say creationists never get published in peer-reviewed journals. And that also is wrong. I got my research published in the Journal of Parasitology, along with my advisor, Dr. Gerald D. Schmidt, but I was first author in this particular research, and I was very honored to do that. But it was very exciting to make a discovery, finding a parasite. In this example, it was a nematode, this small white roundworm that lived inside the colon of the muscularis mucosa of the stomach. And so I found that using a dissection microscope. And so it was fun doing that. And so creationists can do research, they can make discoveries, and they can get the research published as long as they don't give it away that they're creationists. And then, of course, they're simply dismissed out of hand. And so we find pigeons and doves as well. They're used synonymously in Scripture. Pigeons were eaten by the Hebrews, and from Abraham's time, they were used in sacrifice, as we see at the bottom of the screen there, as the Mary and Joseph taking Lord Jesus to the temple and giving him to the high priest for their dedication. Two young pigeons, the one for the burnt offering and the other for a sin offering, according to the Levitical law, chapter 12. And so this is very interesting. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint, according to Isaiah chapter 40. And Exodus chapter 19, how I bear you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. And so the eagle is a very, very majestic bird, a very majestic carnivorous creature. So where do birds come from according to evolution? I mean, we look at birds there and say, according to evolution, where did they come from? And of course, the evolutionists look at a heavy-tailed theropod dinosaur. And a theropod dinosaur would be, for example, an excellent example would be T-Rex, Tyrannosaurus Rex. They say a heavy-tailed theropod dinosaur, through time and chance and genetic mistakes that we call mutations, through this time and chance and mutations, this heavy-tailed theropod dinosaur became this. This is what we call the bee hummingbird of Cuba, the world's smallest bird. You can see the mama bird is perched on the end of a pencil eraser. That's just a little bit of nothing. And yet evolutionists will say with a straight face, yes, this little metabolic furnace that we call a hummingbird came from a heavy-tailed theropod dinosaur. And I'm going, I'm sorry, I simply cannot buy that on scientific and biblical and logical grounds. In those three areas, I cannot accept that explanation. And so here is the mama has made a nest and put in two of her eggs there, and you can see a house key that they have used to show just how tiny these are. And the bee hummingbird, the mama can make her nest inside of a hollowed out golf ball. So this is amazing. And when I look at that bee hummingbird, I sure do not think of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. That's one of the furthest things from my mind. And so here we have not a cross section, but it shows the structure of an eagle wing. And this eagle wing is so unlike the front legs of a theropod dinosaur, or should I say a heavy-tailed theropod dinosaur. Feathers are among the most complex integumentary appendages found in vertebrates. And so when we look at the wing structure of, for example, an eagle, I just don't think of something like these little the front legs of a dinosaur. Theropods had fairly short arms that ended in grasping hands. Folks, it didn't look anything like an eagle's wing there. The two are absolutely different, as different as a theropod dinosaur to a bee hummingbird of Cuba. And so this is called evolutionary artistic license. And you can see an evolutionary artist has had to make a drawing here since there's no fossil evidence. Well, we would say where paleontology fails, artistic license avails. And so heavy-tailed theropod dinosaurs through time and chance and natural processes spanning ever so many millions of years turned out to be a barnyard chicken. But the science there is certainly lacking. But where the study of fossils fails, artistic license avail. The feather looks like any feather you might find on the ground, said this one science report by an individual by the name of Joel, reporting from a discovery made, and he's reporting this in the New York Times just 3 short years ago. He says that this feather, you can see the imprint there on the screen, looks like any feather you might find on the ground. But then he says something interesting. He says, but it's not. And he says it's about 150 million years old. Well, wait a minute. We see this feather and it looks like any feather you would see today, indistinguishable from feathers today. And so what this reporter, Joel said, it's about 150 million years old. And that's just what I call Darwin years. Darwin years, they don't really exist. So we would look at this imprint of a fine feather in the sedimentary rock imprint and say, by faith, this is a feather that was laid down and preserved by the floodwaters of the Genesis flood approximately 4,500 years ago. There's no 150 million years at all. This is a feather from a 100% bird caught up during the flood 4,500 years ago. But there's something else regarding this imprint. Ultra microscopy, that is electron microscope, revealed the presence of thousands of molecules called melanosomes. Well, folks, melanosomes are organic material. That's carbon-based material that should not be there if this fossil is 150 million years old. It's not. We find these melanosomes, they still have the carbon units and all that, indicating that it is youth, it's young. And it's the melanosomes are organelles responsible for the feather's coloration. And so according to evolutionary theory, you shouldn't have any carbon-based material in there whatsoever. It all should have been replaced by minerals during the alleged 150 million years, but it isn't. We find not only carbon-based material, but we find pigmentation as well, indicating the youth of these fossils, the youth of these fossils. Evidence from developmental biology, and I like that field, I like to read up on developmental biology, is very damaging to the classical view that feathers evolved from elongate scales. And this is what evolutionists say. You've got these reptiles that have these scales, and through millions of years of evolution and change and mutations, these scales somehow got frayed out and became feathers. But as these two evolutionists, and by the way, they're no friend of the creationists. Now look at the date there, that's 2004. Okay, so I'm admitting this evening, this is an old quote from a dictionary of biology. It's still 21st century, and it's still by two individuals that are very much opposed to creation science. But what they're saying, class, is true. Evidence from developmental biology is very damaging to the classical view that feathers evolved from elongate scales. And so I thought, well, wait a minute, this is 2004. I'm going to find a developmental biology textbook and see what they have to say about scales turning into what? That's right, feathers. And so here's what I did. Okay, here are the scales, and the feathers are on the other side, next to the scales there. One turned into the other through time and chance. No creator, no designer was involved. How is it that these scales that you see here on the right can turn into something as sophisticated and detailed, enormously complex as the structure, the morphology of a feather? And so I went to this book right here about these two evolutionists that you see in the top of the screen there. It was blocked out for me, but you can read their names, Barish and Gilbert. And in the 12th edition of their developmental biology text, I looked in the index and was fairly shocked to find there was no mention of feathers and no mention of scales that are mentioned in this text. Well, look, if the scales evolved into feathers, we should be able to see through the science of developmental biology how one became the other. And what a shock it is to go to a developmental biology text and not even find the words feather or scales mentioned, at least not in the index. And I have not read Barish and Gilbert's book completely from cover to cover, but it's not there in the index. And so I thought that was interesting. Here we have some dinosaur skin. Now, this is skin imprints, I should say. This is the mud from floodwaters that have gone up against the carcass of the dinosaur as they were being catastrophically and suddenly buried. And this imprint has been made by this mud going up against the carcass of the dinosaur. And we can see it right here. We can see the pebbled texture of the dinosaur skin and see that, wow, this is what dinosaur skin looked like. You know, usually when we think of fossils, we just think of the bones. But to have something like skin here, that's icing on the cake, isn't it? And so remember, evolutionists say that dinosaurs became what? That's right, birds. Dinosaurs became birds. So if this is dinosaur skin, what's the logical question you would ask? That's right. Where are the feathers? Where are the feathers? I'm looking for feathers. I'm not finding them anywhere there. But evolutionists tell us that the scales became feathers slowly and gradually over millions of years and so forth. Now, we should keep in mind when it comes to birds that the life of a bird is absolutely dependent on their doing what we call preening. If you've owned a bird, if you had parakeets or whatever else like that, or a parrot, you can see that parrots or parakeets spend a lot of time, maybe 1/3 of their waking hours, doing nothing but preening their feathers. Why? Because as it says on the top of the screen there, their life depends on preening their feathers so that those feathers are fully functional to give the lift that is needed and required and for the midair acrobatics of the creature and all that. And so nothing is more common for a bird as it's sitting there to preen its feathers, as you can see in these three examples. Now remember, evolutionists say that dinosaur scales turned into or evolved into what? Feathers, okay? And so these proto feathers on these dinosaurs that were slowly becoming birds, how could a dinosaur preen its feathers? Because if you look at the beak structure, look at the beak structures of those three birds there. Those beaks are exquisitely designed, not only for cracking seeds and all that, but it just so happens that their beaks are also designed to preen the feathers. Look at the structure of those beaks. Now look at the structure of the mouth of a dinosaur. I can't say this without smiling. I'm sorry, but can you see how a dinosaur can preen its feathers? I cannot. I can't. Okay. I don't know how dinosaurs could preen their feathers. And remember, what do we say about the life of a bird? The life of a bird is absolutely dependent on its ability to preen the feathers of something like the dinosaur would not be able to do. So what would happen in the space of just days to weeks If the dinosaur can't preen its feathers and the feathers are getting mashed and mushed and all that as the dinosaur is tromping around, all that, those feathers would be destroyed. The feathers would be destroyed, and the dinosaur can't do anything about it. It doesn't have its any kind of beak or anything else that would help with that. And so this is a good question to ask. Now, to be fair, there's an evolutionist by the name of Michael Benton, Benton, and he has maybe an idea, an answer to this. I'm not convinced reading his paper, but I want to be fair about this. Michael Benton is his name. And so here we have birds, for example, that undertake something called anting, Anting. Well, Frank, what is anting all about? Well, I'm a parasitologist, an invertebrate zoologist, and we have mites. You've heard about mites, very, very tiny arthropods that get in and can cause problems as they establish themselves on the exterior of a bird. And they start to eat parts of the feather, and they eat some of the fluffed off of epidermis skin cells of the bird and all that, and it can cause irritation and secondary bacterial infection of the bird if you don't take care of these external parasites called mites. And mites are they're arthropods, but they're not true. I won't get into that, but they're arthropods and they're external parasites. And so what the creator has done is had the birds be able to use ants, the ants, which has formic acid, and the birds will actually lay down on an anthill and let the ants come up into the wings and get up inside the feathers and all that and start to eat the mites, or the ants might secrete something called formic acid. Formic acid is the simplest of the carboxylic acids in biochemistry. And so active anting is when the bird using its beak will pick up an ant, squish it, releasing the formic acid, and then the bird will rapidly rub its feathers with the antibody. And so, sorry, and it will rub all those feathers with that formic acid from the ant, and it will kill the external parasites, for example, the mites and all that. And the passive anting would be when you have the bird spreading its wings out on an anthill and just let the ants crawl around there and eat the mites and secrete the formic acid and all that. And so here's a structure of formic acid. Again, it's a carboxylic acid, COOH. Formic acid, for example, is used as food preservative since it has antibacterial properties. But you look at this structure of an ant there, and you see the large abdomen has a specific name for it, full of formic acid. And so it can go ahead and be, the ant gets killed, but the bird squishes that body of the ant and helps to get rid of those external parasites. And so we would say that it's the antacid, the acid of the ant, the formic acid. And here we have rolaids and antacid. So antacid and then antacid. So I just thought that was a kind of, okay, moving right along. So this is something I think is interesting, is this optical triangulation is utilized to obtain the relative azimuth information of the estimated target. This is from a secular researcher talking about the F-18 Eagle fighter aircraft. And you can look in the cockpit of this F-18 and see just what the pilot has to do in order to zero in on an enemy aircraft or whatever. And this is the sophisticated quote of what all has to be done as you're flying close to the speed of sound and you're tracking with radar this information that is being fed into a computer by way of the various sophisticated electronic information processors and all, and the utilized to obtain the relative azimuth information of the estimated target. And nothing is left to chance when they finally fire the missile that hopefully will zero in on the enemy target there. And so this is a very, very sophisticated process. However, God thought of it first, even through all of this. we find that the eagle has this incredible visual system. Eagles are designed with retinas, also with cones, but also much deeper fovea, a cone-rich structure with no rods in the back of the eye. These give them a visual acuity, an impressive 20 to 5 or 20 to 4, which is incredible vision. We talk about 20/20 vision. They have something a lot better than 20/20 vision. They have 25 or 24, which is not infinitely, but is significantly better than how we see. And it allows them to hunt tiny prey from hundreds of feet up. For example, raptors such as an eagle, but hawks and everything else will fly above an open field, but they'll be hundreds of feet up in the air, and they are able to see a field mouse scurrying around down there. They can see the gentle rustling of the grass or whatever else, and then they simply fold their wings and track as they go down many, and very, very quickly, very fast. They just become a furry, a feathered missile, and they stop at the last instant and use their claws to pick up that hot lunch, that tiny morsel there. And so they use the same thing that the F-18 does, but with a lot less energy and a lot less things that can go wrong. Again, the optical triangulation is utilized to obtain the relative azimuth, that is the angle information of the estimated target. Eagles and other raptors do this all the time. And yes, indeed, we can do that too, but it's very clunky and it's very energy. It takes a whole lot of energy, and it works most of the time, but not all of the time. I'm a Navy veteran. In Vietnam, I was on an aircraft carrier during the Vietnam War. I worked up on the flight deck for my first cruise. And this is the open avionics bay of your typical fighter aircraft. And so you can open up the avionics bay, and it exposes all of this sophistication, this hardware, this electronic gear. And some of it will go bad, and then they just have to R&R, that is, remove and replace. And so to keep the systems up and operating as they do. But in order, but what about a raptor? What about that eagle we're talking about? Well, this is a cross section of the brain of an eagle, and it's greatly enlarged, because if you look at the skull of an eagle, it's pretty small, which means that the brain would be even smaller. But the eagle can do everything that the electronics bay that you can see there in that typical fighter aircraft can do, and the eagle can do it better, and it uses a whole lot of less energy than what the aircraft uses. So this is a generator of your typical jet engine. I was a jet engine mechanic. I worked on big turbofan engines, and you have in the accessory gearbox on the jet engine that had to run things like the high pressure and low pressure fuel pumps, and the hydraulic pumps, and the generator that you're looking at there. The generator produces a lot of electricity that is needed to give electricity for these particular things that you see in the avionics bay I showed you in the upper left-hand corner there. Well, what about the bird? How much energy does it use? Well, obviously it doesn't have a generator like you're seeing at the top of the screen there, but this is what the bird does. The bird will eat its prey, and when it eats its prey, it extracts energy from it through a process called glycolysis. Glycolysis, if you break the word down, glyco, which means a carbohydrate, and lysis, which means to break. So for example, sugar is C6H12O6, and through glycolysis, a 6-carbon sugar molecule is broken down into 2 3-carbon molecules. These 2 3-carbon molecules are energy rich, goes through something called the pyruvate dehydrogenase system, and one of those carbons is cleaved off until you have just a 2-carbon molecule called an acetyl group. This acetyl group is then introduced into the Krebs cycle. Maybe you remember hearing about the Krebs cycle, also called the tricarboxylic acid cycle. But the 2-carbon acetyl group is introduced into the Krebs cycle to a 4-carbon molecule. 4 plus 2, the 2-carbon acetyl group, is 6. And you have a very brief 6-carbon molecule there, and it goes around kind of in a circle. That's why they call it the Krebs cycle. Through that time, something called nicotinamine adenine dinucleotide phosphate, which is an enzyme, biochemically carves off some of those hydrogens that are energy rich and introduces it into what is called a special process which phosphorylates adenosine diphosphate, that ADP. You see at the bottom of the screen there? That's di, that means two. And through this process, it hooks on another phosphate. So ADP plus one phosphate gives you ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Well, that's called the energy currency of the cell. And again, if you took high school biology or maybe college biology, you remember hearing about that molecule, that amazing energy-rich molecule called ATP. Well, this is what the bird uses, and this is what we use. This is what the blue whale uses, what dinosaurs used, and so forth. ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so the aircraft that we have in the 21st century is able to do a lot of what the eagle does, but the eagle is far more efficient in its utilization of energy and its ability to track and to get its prey virtually 100% of the time. Sometimes it does miss. And so I like this slide here because it's a comparison and contrast of what man can do with all the clunky material that they have at our disposal, plus a huge generator that makes a whole mess of energy, plus what God has exquisitely designed in this tiny brain of an eagle using this process of energy acquisition through phosphorylation of adenosine diphosphate, just a little bit of nothing inside of just one of those cells. Okay, and by the way, the weight of the eagle brain is about 11 grams. So that's that's just a little bit. And all of this is going on inside of this eagle brain. It's just utterly amazing. Well, Solomon imported peacocks from other nations for his royal court in Israel. It says in 1 Kings chapter 10, once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. And I like peacocks because we have some living nearby right here in Flower Mound, Texas. Some people have kind of I don't want to say a peacock farm, but they have at least a dozen or maybe even 2 dozen peacocks very close to the high school that my son and daughter graduated from, Flower Mound High School. And one of the peacocks came into our backyard and was flying around. It was absolutely amazing things to see. And peacocks have been designed by the creator to have this incredible, sophisticated coloration that you could see here. The peacock's feather design is just amazing. It's right up there with, for example, the design of the hummingbird with its kind of coloration, and also the blue jay as well. But in this case, we find well-aligned melanin rods. And these white and black pictures you see there in the right-hand part of the screen there, that's an electron micrograph. So they had to use an electron microscope that would magnify thousands of times what you see when you look at the ordinary macroscopic picture of the peacock feather. And when you read the phrase from this 2012 science publication, well-aligned melanin rods, could we not also say, class, well-designed melanin rods? Yeah, they are well aligned, as you can see it in the middle of the top of the screen there, but well aligned, I would say, also means well designed. And design means a designer. Design means a designer. The diffraction grating occurs when light splits and diffracts into several beams traveling in different directions. And this is where you can get, just depending on where you stand and how the light is striking the feather and then reflected back to your eye, what kinds of shades of color that you see here. And so you see, for example, parallel rods of melanin forming a diffraction grating. And that diffraction grating is described here on the right-hand side of the screen in the white lettering there. And so nothing is left to chance when you have this very sophisticated diffraction grating of these peacock feathers and other feathers as well. I got to move on. We're getting close to quitting here. Average speaking speed is 120 words per minute. I'm going to have to go right along at 350 with gusts up to 400. So I'm going to have to go pretty fast here. Atmospheric Optics, a secular publication, talks about the rods are separated by transparent keratin, and there are holes threaded between squares formed by the rods. And this is what we call nano engineering. Nanotechnology, nano means extremely small, very, very small. And that's the new wave in technology, is this nano engineering or nanotechnology. But guess what? God thought of it first. And so we find that mankind is copying what God has designed in his animals. Even though we have been cursed with sin, and sin is called the corruption of the creation, still we can see some amazing things that the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 1 is clearly seen. And Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, God said, God's creation is clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Like, for example, these rods, they're found in peacock feathers, in hummingbird feathers, and blue jays, and other types of creatures. Morpho butterflies of South America also have the same concept going on. Well, let's look at some of God's insects very, very quickly here. And you can see insects come in all sizes and all shapes, and they have not evolved. When you start looking and inquiring into the secular literature about the origin of various groups of insects, you come to a brick wall. They don't know where any of these insects evolved from a non-insect ancestor. It just doesn't happen. All these insects are a small group of what is called the phylum Arthropoda. The phylum Arthropoda, the late Steve Gould said, is the largest phylum in the world. Phylum Arthropoda has parrot-jointed appendages and a chitinous exoskeleton, such as what you see in these pictures. Now, do we normally attribute these high-precision gears that you see there in the middle of the screen from an explosion in a steel mill? No, we don't. Now, somebody years ago said, Frank, those gears are not able to turn, they would jam. And I understand that. That's okay. The reason why I included this particular picture of these gears is to show how exquisitely designed they are. You have to have an engineer who knows what he's doing in order to make these gears and get them to mesh in a very specific way. So obviously, no, they won't turn, but that's not the reason why. I just want you to see just how sophisticated this can get. So a British evolutionist, an atheist, he was a British zoologist, took pictures of the legs of this tiny insect using an electron microscope. And this is a picture of the actual insect, but this researcher, this British zoologist, invertebrate zoologist, took an electron micrograph picture of the legs of the plant hopper nymph. And so he did the research using the electron microscope, and he said, what we have here is the prototype for incredibly small, high speed, high precision gears. So this is what Dr. Sutton was talking about, the evolutionary atheist at the University of Bristol. By the way, that's where Michael Benton, B-E-N-T-O-N, is also from. And this guy, Sutton, is talking about high precision gears. This is the picture that he took. So we can see that these are living gears, just like the gears we saw, the steel gears there, and they intermesh beautifully. And it looks designed. And we have to keep in mind that design means a designer, creation means a creator. And so living things clearly look like they were designed. So how do evolutionists know they weren't designed? This is a question of the evening. Living things clearly look like they were designed. So how do evolutionists know that they were not designed? And so this is a clear case for Romans chapter 1 and verse 20. God's creation is clearly seen. And here we find, the book of Proverbs, of course, tells an individual to go look at the ant, you sluggard, and see how the ants work out all the time here. And this is something that's very, very rare. This is a fossil of an ant, but it's a very large ant, as we can see here. And so zoologists looked at this and the size of it, and they're calling it a giant. A giant. And so we can say that ants have always been ants, haven't they? And so even in the very beginning, we see that ants have always been ants, and insects, all the different kinds of insects have always been insects. And so this is evolution said is the second oldest known ant. That's okay with me. Ants have always been ants. And Psalm 19 talks about also then honey and the honeycomb. And, bees, of course, make honey and all, and it's very, very amazing job that they do. Uh, I have a 45-minute talk just on bees. They can recognize human faces. It looks like they can count. They can do basic math. Their navigation abilities are absolutely amazing. How is it that a bee can fly away from the hive up to a half a mile and be blown around, buffeted by the wind and clouds covering the sun and all that, and yet the bee can turn around and go right back, I guess you could call it a beeline back to the hive. And it's all due to the design of the bee brain, which is about the size of your typical grass seed. Grass seeds are just a little bit of nothing. That's the size of the bee brain. But with it, the bee can do some utterly amazing things. Now, I said that bees can recognize human faces, and that's true. If there's some young ladies out there, I want to share with you just what one brave young lady did. And here she is, and she's smiling. And, as long as she doesn't make any false moves or start waving her hands or shouting, she'd be just fine. And these bees are coming up to her and giving her bee kisses and all, and she's doing just fine. And so, bees are just amazing creatures. We don't understand a part of what they are able to do, but we are amazed at their ability. It says, in the day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly, that is the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And so here is your typical bee. An individual, an evolutionist by the name of Hugo on PBS program in 2017 said, and I quote, "These are highly intelligent creatures." And you know what? He's absolutely right. This is one of the rare times that I agree wholeheartedly with the evolutionist. Bees are utterly amazing and intelligent creatures. They truly are. And if you look at how bees live in the hives and how they're, in order to undergo, use air conditioning and all that, and to identify invaders, it is very, very amazing. Bees have what's called nectar guides that are visible to the bees, but not to the humans. And so if you look at the top screen with the purple there, that flower, this is what we enjoy looking at, the aesthetic value of it. Bees are not interested in the aesthetic value. They are interested in what's called the nectar guides. The Lord Jesus has designed the bee eyes to see in the ultraviolet. We cannot see in the ultraviolet. Bees can. And with the ultraviolet vision, they are able to see what you see in the lower portion of the screen there, that lower picture. And we call it nectar guides. And we've known about nectar guides for decades. And the ultraviolet image generates 3 rings of color that actually guides the bees to the nectar. And to the nectar there. So it is amazing what the bees are able to do. The brain of a bee is only about the size of a single grass seed, that is less than 1 million neurons or nerve cells. But it's the way that the nerve cells are actually wired. We have a 3.5-pound brain, which contains billions of neurons plus sustentacular cells called astrocytes. And we have 2 different kinds of astrocytes, protoplasmic astrocytes, for example, that help to support the neurons themselves. And so when people get brain cancer, it's not the nerve cells that get cancerous, it's those sustentacular cells, for example, the astrocytes that become cancerous and a tumor is formed. But anyway, this is amazing ability the Lord Jesus has put inside of these bees. With less than 1 million neurons, are able to do so much, because now zoologists are figuring out it's not how many neurons, but how the neurons are interconnected in the making up the network. And they're just beginning to understand that. And so here's another example of nectar guides. We enjoy the dandelion as long as it's not in our lawn. And the bees are not interested in that. They're interested in the nectar dyes that they see in the ultraviolet, which is on the other side of the screen, the right-hand side of the screen. And just a FYI, a whale's brain has over 2 billion neurons, 200 billion neurons. And so going back to where we were talking about whales at the beginning of our talk here. And so this guy by the name of Polnar is a professor emeritus in OSU, and he said this just 3 years ago, but most our bees fossils are from the last 65 million years. And what did he say? He said they look a lot like modern bees. What can we say, class, as we draw to a close here this evening? We can say that bees have always been what? That's right. Bees have always been bees. And this little trilobite, the compound eye, is almost the same size of that of the bees, dragonflies of today, and many modern diurnal crustaceans. And so this was said just, as I say, 3 years ago. Bees have always been bees. Dragonflies have always been dragonflies. They are designed with the same structures and the morphology that we have in the ones today. And so I won't get into this, but this is part of the trilobite omatidia and the individual omatidial cell that you see in the diagrammatic form on the left-hand side of your screen there. And it's an individual light-sensitive unit. We call it an omatidia. A desert locust adult can eat its own weight, about 2 grams per day. A typical locust lives about 3 to 5 months. They can stay in the air for long periods. In 1988, some traveled from West Africa to the Caribbean in about 10 days. And so locusts are simply eating machines. Plague number 8 in Exodus chapter 10 talks about the plague of the locusts and how they can decimate entire fields in hours, and then go on to the next field and destroy that as well. And I'm not going to get into this because it gets in a little bit too much, and I want to be able to open up for question and answer and all. This guy, Dr. Gilbert Waldebauer, a professor emeritus in my hometown, in my home state of Illinois, was pretty sarcastic about creationists and about how many legs that a locust had, and Moses got it wrong and all that, but Moses was absolutely right. And so we can look at even the evolutionists. They're talking about walking legs and jumping legs together. They make up the 6 legs and so forth. So scripture is being very precise as to distinguish the front 4 from the back 2, just as this science lab book, entomology, an insect lab book is as well. So. And so I'll just go ahead and jump through that. And this is a verse that I like to use as I complete my talk on animals. It comes from Job chapter 12, talking about of all mankind, and just a beautiful, beautiful way to summarize what the from the oldest book of the Bible, the book of Job, and living creatures, living things. And so, okay. That's what I have this evening. And Robin or Terry, if you want to go ahead and open up for questions, I'll do my best.
Yes, and that was really great. And some of those things were just very unbelievable. So
we had Dr. Steve Austin and his wife, who's a medical doctor, do a presentation on bees, and it was really good. And sounds like you know a lot about bees too, so that might be something we may ask you to speak on in the future. But go ahead, Terry. Sorry.
I would
go
be
ahead.
honored.
For those of you who are watching along with us, you may not know this, but maybe there are a couple of us on the screen right now who really enjoy puns. So anyway, we have a lot of chatter in the comments. Some of it is puns and some of it are questions, but then they were answered by your special guests. So
well, not the bombardier beetle. Ubiquitous.
No.
It means everywhere. I was looking for a more specific, like I'm in Florida. Where would I find a bombardier beetle?
Oh,
Or
well,
what if you live in Wisconsin?
yeah, Wisconsin, Florida, they're ubiquitous. You just have to know what they look like. They belong to the genus Brachynes, and they like to live in layered rocks and debris, where you find, for example, leaves and sticks and all that in the various layered areas of rock there. It's hard to explain exactly where they like to live, but you have to just know where to look. But you can find them there, and
Interesting.
I was so honored to be able to pick one up and have them blast against my finger there. So in the preceding years, I'd be able to tell audiences I've actually held one of these things, and I can tell you it's hot, it hurts, and yeah. Once again, we can go to the source of ultimate information in the world, Wikipedia, and it'll probably tell you where to look on that.
Okay. Now your friend David McQueen, he had to leave, but before
Okay.
he left, he said, how do the evolutionary, I'm sorry, how do the evolutionary biologists or paleontologists estimate the age of mammal fossils? Do they use uranium lead or potassium argon trapped in the camel's skull in the rock record?
Oh, yeah, that was always a good question from Professor McQueen, Terry. Thank you. Are there any other questions? No. um, okay, that's not really my area of strength there. But basically, what they do is they find mammals in a particular layer of sedimentary rock, and then that's how they date it. It's a circuitous dating technique that the layers are dated by the fossils that are in the layers, and we know what the layers age is because we find the fossils there. So one validates the other, and it's what we call in science a tautology, a circular reasoning and all. On occasion, you can use carbon-14 dating, which uses with living material. And with a mammal fossil, we would not be surprised to find soft tissue, since we're finding soft tissue in dinosaurs. And so all of a sudden now we can use carbon-14 dating, which is, again, I say, only good for material that has been alive. And so when we find nice, soft, squishy, stretchy dinosaur fibers, we can use carbon-14. Now, here's the key, and I don't want to get away from what Professor McQueen was talking about with mammals, but just using dinosaurs as an example, the evolutionary community has refused to carbon-14 date dinosaur tissue because they are locked in to the idea, the theory, the hypothesis that dinosaurs became extinct 66 million years ago. Carbon-14 dating is only good for thousands of years. And so they say it'd be a waste of time to carbon-14 date the soft dinosaur tissue because we know, they said, that dinosaurs became extinct 66 million years ago. So here you have a situation where you have the physical material in your hands, soft dinosaur tissue, waiting to be dated by C14 process, carbon-14, and the evolution say, no, I'm not going to do it. And so what we did is do what we call an end run around the evolutionist. We have gone to find our own soft dinosaur tissue and gone through a third party to get the soft dinosaur tissue dated by carbon-14 dating. And the results have always come back in the thousands of years, not 66 million years or 100 million years or whatever. When we show that information to the evolutionists, they say one word: contamination. And we show some more, they say contamination. And they use that card, the contamination card, every time we show soft dinosaur tissue being dated by a lab that gives thousands of years. Okay, now getting back to Professor McQueen's question in regard to the mammals, if we're finding soft tissue with dinosaurs, we can, there are mammal fossils there, and I'm sure that they would be able to find soft tissue as well, which means we could use carbon-14 type dating.
Okay. And so your daughter wanted to point out too that they're not being intellectually honest or vulnerable with that then.
Right. It's, and again, we've been trying to be diplomatic and ask the evolutionary community, look, work with us on this. We're finding soft dinosaur tissue. Mary Schweitzer, is no friend of the creationist, and she was the one that kind of got the ball rolling when she and her team in South Carolina, or no, excuse me, she's from South Carolina. They were in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, and they found a femur of a T-Rex, and it broke open, and there was soft tissue. And so Mary Schweitzer is a top-notch scientist, and she was intellectually honest, and she looked at the soft tissue, and she did everything that she could to show that even though it's soft tissue, it still has to be 66 plus million years old. But then when she went on TV and they were stretching those fibers there, it's hard to say that that stretchy material lasted over 66 million years. And why in the world don't the evolutionists use carbon-14 dating? Well, we all know why.
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be alive. Just a few weeks ago, we had Dr. Lyle on talking about the findings from the James Webb Space Telescope. So
Yeah.
I think between the dinosaur soft tissue and the astronomy things, like, it's pretty interesting to watch these people scramble to defend their worldview is really what they're doing.
I
So
appreciate Dr. Lyle making these predictions that he made prior to the James Webb Telescope taking those infrared pictures. And he made sure that he had the predictions written down. And
yeah.
sure enough, after the pictures were developed, and this is something you already know because Dr. Lyle talked about it, he was right, and the evolutionists are wrong, basically. You were finding, the mature galaxies, way back when, or young, I forget how he phrased it there. So I don't want to get into his field there, but it was neat.
It is exciting. So we actually got a question ahead of time from one of our new friends. His name is Dom, and he's been watching some of our past videos. And so something jumped out at him from a few videos ago where we had somebody who actually brought animals on the screen with him. And so he was talking about, and we've heard this before, that I think it's the expression is eyes in front, I like to hunt, and eyes on side, I like to hide. So when his question comes down to when God created everything originally and it was perfect, and I think that we've heard or we've studied that in the beginning the animals weren't needing to eat each other. So
Right.
why were their eyes designed that way to begin with? If that wasn't necessary, like, is that something that
Right.
God planned ahead?
Well, there's always an interesting question, and that's why we are called the Institute for Creation Research. Okay, so we're the Institute for Creation Research. We're researching questions such as that. We're not called the Institute for Creation Answers. Okay, and so we're researching that. We do know that there's various morphological shapes and design of creatures. For example, their ocular ability and all that. But it gets into, Terry, what you're talking about, the predator-prey situation and parasites and poisons. And just to kind of let the cat out of the bag, I have an hour-long presentation just on the question you asked there, the predator-prey relationship. When it comes to predators, parasites, poisons, taxes. Oh no, not taxes, but anyway, that was a joke. All the situation with these, the predator prey, and why we have these animals with the large fangs and the poisons that they secrete and all that. It gets into something called the Hawaiian bobtail squid that uses a cholera bacterium to its benefit. And again, it's a whole hour-long presentation where I address questions such as what you had there, Terry. Now, when it comes to the eyes, the eyes are eyes, wherever we find them. And, it doesn't necessarily validate evolution. And so we would, it doesn't at all, for that matter. And so, yeah, we find that we have different structures, and eyes on the side of the head or in the front there. And what about the big fangs? What about the ability to secrete poisons? My field of parasites. What were parasites before the fall? And we have some ideas regarding that parasites were free living animals. They weren't even parasitic. Adam and Eve were not created with parasites. That came when God cursed the earth. And even evolutionists, for example, admit that parasites have a net loss of genetic information. They have a net loss of systems, body systems, for example. And that's not upward, onward evolution. That's going the opposite way. So that fits the creation model. So I don't know, Terry, if I answered your question.
I think so. I think that that, and also the fact that you've given information about that somebody could find it. I'm guessing, I don't know if that talk is somewhere on YouTube if somebody looked for it, or on your guys' website, on the ICR website, but it's at least a good starting point. So
yeah, if you go to the ICR.org and type in my name, Sherwin, and type in, for example, mosquitoes,
okay.
I answer some of the questions about, why didn't Mr. Noah mash those 2 mosquitoes on the ark and we had the chance? And so anyway, so those are some of the questions that people have.
Okay. Michelle here in Zoom is asking, I have heard that chickens can hybridize with pheasants, turkeys, guinea fowl, and peacocks. Is it known where the original kind would have been placed in the taxonomic system? Is there fossil evidence of this kind?
Wow, that is a good question. Seriously, good question. I haven't heard about the hybridization ability of that. So I'd have to look it up and see, but I don't think that there's any fossil evidence of that. And, we're still researching when it comes to, for example, the genetic ability of one kind of an animal to, hybridize with others. But let me say this, that hybridization is an enemy of evolution. Evolutionists definitely don't like to talk about hybrids or hybridization. And so I'd have to look to see if chickens can, reproduce to some of these other animals. I'm thinking, for example, of wild teosinte. Now, this is a plant, obviously, not an animal. But the wild teosinte is the quote unquote cousin of corn, and that they have been able to domesticate this wild teosinte, a Mexican type corn, to be the kinds of corn varieties that we have today that are so exquisitely designed. Now, corn is still corn. It belongs to the genus Z-E-A, and the genus species name of corn is Z. maize. But we find that corn has become so specialized through the decades of crossbreeding and all that corn would rapidly become extinct, left to its own. And so that's kind of the situation. If I could extrapolate a little bit with animals such as the chicken, the domesticated chicken that we have, they would rapidly become extinct. And so there's a genetic ability of variation that we see. And so we have to, as we are the Institute for Creation research that area of genetics, what we call baraminology, to find out what is the kind of the chicken kind, the quail kind, and where that would end up. That would be some very, very satisfying type of research, and I'm certainly open to it.
Okay, that was a good thorough answer. So well, we've reached the end of our time, although after we sign off, if you want to stay back just for a few minutes for people to turn on their cameras and give a little wave and thank you themselves, we'll do that. But first, before we end the recording and live stream, if you could just remind everybody how they can find information and how they can support your ministry.
Well, I appreciate that, Terry. We are the Institute for Creation Research out of Dallas, and our website is ICR.org. Very, very easy to remember. But what is infinitely more important is that we have a brand new Discovery Center. I say brand new because it opened before the pandemic. And then while the pandemic was in full swing, we were able to add to and update and expand some of our displays out there at the DC, the Discovery Center. So now, as the old saying goes, it's better than ever. So when you come to visit ICR in the DC, I'll give you a personal tour of our Discovery Center, and then we'll go out for lunch and I'll pray and you pay.
Nice.
Okay. That's Okay. All right. And anyway, I'm Terry Camerzell here with Creation Fellowship signing off. And if you want to find more of our past presentations, you can type in tinyurl.com/CF Santee. That's C like creation, F like fellowship, and Santee is spelled Santee. You can also email us at creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com. Boy, Frank, your jokes, like I'm having a hard time keeping my mind straight.
Yeah, and
But
so Terry, I have to tell you, I have a friend of mine named Bob who broke his arm in 2 places, and I said, Bob, you should stop going to those places.
yeah, that's right. But speaking of going, next week we want to invite everybody back, because next week we're going to be doing another one of the talks that we sometimes do, that's consequences of evolutionary thinking. And so next week, our special guest is Reverend Kevin McGarry. He's the founder of Every Black Life Matters, and he'll be talking about how it's Darwinian evolution thinking that leads to ideas that are such as racism and such as that. So anyway, so hopefully you guys can join us next week. And with that, we're going to go ahead and end the live stream and the recording.
Terry, thank you very much. And Robin, thank you as well.